The desert sun was high and bright, pouring golden light across the wide-open lands of Arizona. The year was in the late 1800s, a time when life was hard and survival demanded courage. The land stretched far and empty, with red rocks, dry grass, and endless skies. In this place lived Daniel, a simple ranch hand. He was not the strongest man nor the richest. He owned no land, no cattle of his own, and no big house to call his. But Daniel had a heart people trusted. He was known for his kindness, his willingness to help, and his quiet way of living. He spent his days working with horses, mending fences, and carrying water under the hot sun. His nights were often spent sitting by a small fire, listening to the wind. Daniel often visited a trading post that sat at the edge of both worlds. Settlers brought their goods, and Apache families came to exchange blankets, food, and handmade tools. It was at this post that Daniel first noticed her. She was not like anyone he had seen before. Her name was Nayeli. She carried herself with dignity, her eyes deep and steady like a quiet river. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice had a calm strength. She came to trade baskets woven by her hands. Daniel would often watch from a distance, not daring to step closer, but his respect grew each time she walked by. Though the settlers and Apache people lived close, trust was rare. Old wounds and misunderstandings created tension. But Daniel, unlike many others, saw no enemy in the Apache. He saw people who lived with the land, who had wisdom in their traditions. His heart was curious, not fearful. He wanted to understand. And in Nayeli's presence, this curiosity deepened. One hot afternoon, Daniel went down to the canyon to help haul water. The creek that ran between the rocks was narrow, and many from both sides came to fill their jars. He spotted Nayeli struggling to balance two heavy clay pots. Without a thought, Daniel stepped forward and offered his hands. She hesitated at first, her dark eyes narrowing as if measuring his intent. But when she saw his honest smile, she allowed him to help. That was the first time they stood side by side. Their words were few, mostly gestures and small smiles, but something unspoken passed between them. Not long after, danger arrived. A group of raiders, men from a rival band, came down the canyon path. They were fierce, carrying bows and arrows, their faces painted with warning signs. They were not part of Nayeli's people, but they had a history of attacking both settlers and Apache alike. The air grew heavy as they approached, eyes fixed on Nayeli. Daniel saw the tension in her stance, the fear she tried to hide. He knew in that moment she was the target. Everything happened fast. The raiders raised their bows, and the sharp tips of arrows glinted in the sunlight. The world seemed to slow around Daniel. He could have run. He could have hidden, but his heart gave him no choice. He moved before his mind could think. He stepped directly in front of Nayeli, spreading his arms wide, his body becoming her only shield. The first arrow flew, slicing the air with a deadly whistle. It tore into his shirt and pierced his skin. Pain shot through him like fire, but he did not fall. Another arrow followed, striking his shoulder. Still, he stood firm. Nayeli gasped, her hands reaching for him, but Daniel pushed her gently behind a cluster of rocks. "Stay low," he whispered with clenched teeth. Blood ran warm down his side, but his eyes stayed clear. He would not move. He would not let them take her. The raiders were stunned by his courage. They had expected fear, not sacrifice. Their hesitation gave nearby Apache warriors enough time to respond. From higher ground, Nayeli's kinsmen rushed down with shouts and spears. The raiders, outnumbered, retreated quickly, leaving Daniel bleeding but alive. When the danger passed, silence filled the canyon. Daniel staggered, his knees weak. He tried to stand tall, but his strength left him. He collapsed to the ground, dust rising around him. Nayeli was at his side instantly. She pressed her hands against his wounds, her face full of worry. Her voice trembled as she spoke in her language, words he could not fully understand but felt deeply in his heart. She thanked him, pleaded with him, and promised he would not be alone. Daniel looked up at her through fading vision. He felt the heat of the sun, the sting of the arrows, and the weight of his decision. Yet in that painful moment he felt no regret. He had chosen to protect her, and if it cost him his life, he would have accepted it. But fate had another plan. He remained conscious long enough to see Nayeli's family lifting him onto a makeshift stretcher. They would carry him back, tend to his wounds, and fight for his life. As his eyes closed, the last thing he saw was Nayeli's face, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a strength that told him she would not let him slip away. The desert wind carried his shallow breaths, and the canyon walls held the memory of that day. For Daniel, it was the beginning of a journey he had never expected. A man who lived a quiet life on the edge of two worlds had now stepped into the center of a story much larger than himself. He had chosen to protect a woman who belonged to a people not his own, and in doing so he had crossed invisible lines that divided communities. Every scar he now carried was not just a mark of pain. It was the mark of courage, of connection, and of a bond that would only grow stronger in the days to come. And though he did not yet know it, those scars would one day become his greatest source of pride. Daniel woke to the sound of crackling firewood and the faint smell of herbs. His body felt heavy and his chest burned with every breath. For a moment he thought he was back on the ranch after a hard day's work. But when he opened his eyes, he saw the inside of a large Apache dwelling. The walls were made of wood and covered with hides. Soft light from the fire flickered across the room. He tried to sit up, but sharp pain stopped him, forcing him back down. His shoulder throbbed where the arrow had pierced, and his side ached from the deep wound near his ribs. He heard soft footsteps, and then Nayeli appeared. Her face lit with relief when she saw he was awake. She carried a bowl filled with warm broth and knelt beside him. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice came out rough. "Where am I?" Nayeli placed her hand gently on his arm. "Safe," she said slowly, her English broken but clear. "My people. Help you." He looked at her, confused but grateful. His last memory had been of her face above him in the canyon, her eyes filled with fear and hope. Now she was here tending to him, her calm presence easing his confusion. He took a sip of the broth, the warmth filling his body. Every swallow felt like a small step back to life. Days turned into weeks. Daniel's wounds were serious, but Nayeli and her people did not give up. Each morning she cleaned the cuts with water from the creek. She applied herbs that carried sharp smells yet cooled the pain. She stitched his torn skin with steady hands, her face focused and careful. Daniel endured the treatment with gritted teeth, but he never complained. He could see the effort she put into keeping him alive, and he respected her strength. At night, when the fire burned low and the village grew quiet, Daniel and Nayeli would sit together. At first their words were few. He knew little of her language, and she knew little of his. But they found ways to understand, through gestures, through smiles, through the slow sharing of simple words. He would point to the stars and say sky. She would repeat and tell him the Apache word. He would laugh at his own clumsy attempt to copy her. She would smile softly, correcting him with patience. In those small exchanges, a bond formed. The scars on Daniel's body grew as the wounds healed, dark lines across his chest and shoulders. Some might have seen them as ugly marks, reminders of suffering, but Daniel felt differently. Each scar was proof of his choice, proof that Nayeli still lived because he had stood in front of her. And when she pressed a hand over his chest one evening, looking at the scar above his heart, he saw something in her eyes that words could not explain. Gratitude, yes, but also respect and maybe something deeper. Not everyone in the village welcomed him. Some looked at him with suspicion. To them, Daniel was still an outsider, a settler who had nothing to do with their way of life. A few even muttered that his presence would bring trouble. Daniel understood their caution. He did not expect trust to come easily, but he kept quiet, helping in small ways when he could. He gathered wood, fetched water, and fed the fire. Slowly, a few began to see that he meant no harm. One afternoon, as Daniel practiced walking again outside the dwelling, his legs weak but steady, children gathered around him. They laughed at his awkward steps and offered him sticks to lean on. Their laughter was not cruel, it was playful, curious. Nayeli watched from a distance, her lips curved in a smile. Daniel realized in that moment that he was beginning to belong, not through words or grand acts, but through simple presence and patience. Still, whispers reached his ears. Some settlers nearby mocked him when they learned what he had done. A fool, they said, risking his life for an Apache woman. They could not understand why a man would take arrows meant for someone not of his people. Daniel carried those words quietly. They hurt, but they did not shake his heart. Whenever doubt crept in, he remembered the canyon, the sound of arrows, and the sight of Nayeli alive because of his choice. That memory gave him peace. Nayeli noticed his silence on those days. She would sit with him by the fire, sometimes singing softly in her language. He didn't know the meaning of the words, but the melody comforted him. Slowly, he realized that his wounds were healing not only because of herbs and rest, but because of the care she gave. Healing was not just for the body, it was also for the spirit. One night under the vast desert sky, Daniel asked her softly, "Why care for me?" She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because you saved me," she said simply. Then she touched his arm gently. "And because your heart is true." Her words stayed with him. They were few, but they carried weight. He understood that his sacrifice had built a bridge between them, a bridge that crossed the divides of fear and mistrust. By the time the moon had cycled many times, Daniel could stand tall again. The scars were thick on his skin, and his strength was not yet complete. But he no longer felt like the same man who once lived quietly on the ranch. He had walked through pain, faced death, and been brought back by the care of a woman who once had been a stranger. And deep in his heart, Daniel knew something important. Those scars were not curses. They were signs of a new beginning. He had stepped into a world he never expected, and he had found a connection that was worth every drop of blood, every moment of agony. When Nayeli looked at him now, there was no hesitation in her eyes. She no longer saw him as just a settler. She saw him as the man who had chosen her life over his own. And that truth bound them together in a way that no words could ever fully explain. Daniel's journey of pain was not over. Challenges would come, both from his people and hers. But as he stood one evening at the edge of the canyon where it all began with Nayeli beside him, he whispered to himself, every scar was worth it, and he meant it with all his heart. The days grew warmer as spring painted the desert with touches of green. Small flowers pushed up between rocks, and the creek carried a stronger flow of water. Daniel's strength was returning little by little. He could now walk without leaning on a stick, though his steps were slow. The deep scars across his chest and shoulder were reminders of how close he had come to death, but instead of hiding them, he carried them with quiet pride. Nayeli often walked beside him. Sometimes she spoke of her people's traditions, sometimes of her family. Other times they walked in silence, letting the sound of the wind fill the space. Daniel found comfort in those silences. He had spent much of his life alone, speaking only to animals and the open sky. But with her, silence felt different. It was not empty, it was full. In the evenings, the village gathered around fires. Songs were sung, stories were told, and drums echoed through the night. Daniel listened closely, even if he could not always understand the words. Nayeli explained some of them in simple English. She told him stories of heroes who fought not for themselves but for their people. She told him of ancestors who carried scars as marks of honor. Each story made Daniel realize how much deeper the meaning of his own scars could be. But there were challenges too. Some in the village still doubted him. An older warrior, strong and tall, once stepped forward during a gathering. He pointed at Daniel and spoke sharply in Apache. Daniel could not follow the words, but he understood the tone. It was doubt. It was mistrust. Nayeli translated later, telling him, "He says you are not one of us. He fears you will bring trouble." Daniel did not answer with anger. Instead, he bowed his head slightly. "He has a right to fear," he said softly. "I am not one of you, but I will never bring harm." Nayeli carried his words back to the warrior, and though the man did not fully accept him, he gave a small nod and turned away. Trust, Daniel knew, was not built in one day. It had to grow like the slow desert plants. Strong roots first, blossoms later. One afternoon, Daniel tried to help with the work of the village. His body still ached, but he offered his hands where they were needed. He helped carry wood, fetch water, and even tried to repair one of the clay pots that had cracked. The children laughed at his clumsy attempt, and Nayeli shook her head with amusement. "Not good pot maker," she teased. Daniel laughed too, glad that laughter could live in a place once filled with pain. In those moments, he began to feel part of something larger than himself. He had never known a true family. His parents had died when he was young, and he had grown up working for others. Now, in this circle of people with Nayeli beside him, he felt a sense of belonging he had never imagined. At night, lying under the stars, Daniel thought of the path that had led him here. He wondered why fate had placed him in the canyon that day, why his body had chosen to move before his mind could think. He touched the scars on his chest, feeling the raised lines under his fingers. "Every scar tells a story," he whispered to himself. And the story was not one of weakness, it was one of courage, one of connection. As the weeks passed, Daniel and Nayeli grew closer. Their words became smoother as they learned more of each other's language. Sometimes they sat by the creek, and Nayeli showed him how to weave simple baskets. His large hands struggled with the delicate work, but she laughed softly and guided him. Other times, he showed her how to mend a saddle strap or tie a knot the way ranchers did. They were from different worlds, yet they shared skills, laughter, and moments of quiet care. But whispers still traveled beyond the village. Settlers in nearby towns heard stories of the ranch hand who had taken arrows for an Apache woman. Some called him a hero, but others mocked him. "He's lost his senses," one man sneered at the trading post. "Risking his life for people who aren't his own." Daniel ignored such talk when it reached his ears. But deep inside, he knew it would not be the last time he faced such judgment. One evening, Nayeli sat with him as the sun dipped low. She looked serious, her eyes thoughtful. "My family worries," she admitted quietly. "They say, if you stay, it will bring more trouble. Settlers may not like. Some of my people may not like." Daniel listened, his heart heavy. He had known this truth, but hearing it from her lips made it real. "And you?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then met his eyes. "I do not care about their fear. You saved me. You showed heart. That is enough for me." Her words gave him strength, but they also deepened his resolve. He knew their journey would not be simple. Love, respect, and connection were powerful, but so were prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding. He would have to prove himself again and again, not with grand gestures, but with steady patience. The bond between them grew like a flame, quiet but strong. It was tested by doubts, but each test only made it brighter. Daniel began to understand that his life had changed forever in that canyon. He was no longer just a ranch hand living quietly on the edges of society. He was part of a story that joined two worlds, and his scars were the bridge. One night, as they sat together watching the stars, Nayeli told him, "In our way, scars are not shame. They are memory. They are proof that you lived, that you fought, that you gave." She reached out and traced the scar on his shoulder with her finger. "Your scars mean you chose to stand. I will never forget." Daniel felt a deep warmth in his chest, stronger than the pain of any wound. He realized then that his scars were no longer his alone. They belonged to both of them, to the story they now shared. The desert wind blew softly, carrying with it the scent of sage. The night was quiet yet full of meaning. Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a truth that came from his heart. "If I had to do it again, I would." Every scar was worth it, and Nayeli, sitting beside him, placed her hand over his and simply nodded. The sun dipped low over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Daniel stood near the edge of the canyon, the place where everything had changed. His body was healed enough for him to move without pain, though his scars would never leave. He touched his chest absent-mindedly, remembering the arrows that had struck him. Every scar was now part of his story, and he no longer wished to hide them. Still, he felt the weight of whispers carried by the wind. Some settlers called him a fool for standing with the Apache. Some of the Apache still doubted whether an outsider could be trusted. The tension pressed on him from both sides like a rope pulled tight. Life in the village had become more familiar, but it was not easy. Daniel worked hard to prove his loyalty. He helped gather wood, carried water from the creek, and joined hunts even when his body still ached. Some nodded at his efforts while others remained cold. He understood. Trust was not given freely. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be tested. One evening, as the firelight flickered in the village circle, voices grew sharp. An older warrior spoke against him again, saying Daniel's presence would draw danger. He pointed at Daniel's scars and declared that they were not marks of honor but marks of foolishness. The words stung, but Daniel kept his voice calm. "These scars are proof that I would stand for Nayeli, even against death. I ask for nothing in return but the chance to live in peace." Nayeli translated his words, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. Some murmured with approval, others shook their heads. The debate was not finished, but something in Daniel's tone made even the harsh warrior pause. Still, the conflict was not only within the village. Word reached the nearby settlement that Daniel was spending his days among the Apache. A group of men confronted him when he visited the trading post. "You're one of them now?" One sneered. "Turning your back on your own people?" Daniel stood tall, his eyes firm. "I have not turned my back on anyone. I stood for what was right. I would do it again." The men laughed bitterly, muttering that he would regret it. Daniel walked away, but he felt the weight of their anger. He knew their prejudice would not disappear easily. Through it all, Nayeli remained his anchor. She stood beside him, defending him when others doubted. She taught him more of her language, sharing words that spoke of family, honor, and love. They built their bond not with grand promises but with daily acts of care. She would weave a small basket and leave it at his side. He would repair her tools with quiet dedication. Each gesture spoke louder than words, yet challenges tested their bond. When a group of Apache hunters prepared for a long journey, Daniel offered to join. Some rejected the idea, saying he would slow them down, but Nayeli's brother, a man named Dakota, finally agreed to give him a chance. The hunt was long and difficult. Daniel struggled at first, his body not as skilled as the warriors around him. He stumbled, missed his target, and earned quiet laughter. But he did not give up. He followed instructions, learned quickly, and when a deer was finally taken, he carried the heavy weight on his shoulders without complaint. By the time they returned, Dakota gave him a nod of respect. It was not open acceptance, but it was a step forward. Slowly, Daniel began to notice a change. The same children who once laughed at his clumsy steps now ran to him with excitement, asking for stories of ranch life. Some of the elders spoke to him with curiosity, asking about the tools settlers used. The barrier was not gone, but cracks began to show, and within those cracks light entered, but acceptance had its price. One night, Nayeli confessed her fears. "Some in my family say I risk too much with you. They fear I will lose respect if I stand with a man not of my people." Daniel listened quietly, his heart heavy. He took her hand gently. "I cannot change who I am," he said, "but I can promise that my heart is true. Whatever comes, I will face it." She looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "I know, that is why I stay." Together they faced every doubt, and slowly the bond between them began to change the hearts around them. When the older warrior who once opposed Daniel saw him risk his safety again, this time pulling a child away from a runaway horse, his hard expression softened. He did not speak words of apology, but he no longer raised his voice against him. That silence itself was a kind of acceptance. Daniel's scars, once seen as ugly wounds, became symbols. To the settlers who mocked him, they were marks of betrayal. But to Nayeli and to those who began to see differently, they were marks of loyalty, of sacrifice, of love. Daniel did not care about the opinions of those who could not understand. What mattered was that he had done what was right, and that Nayeli's life had been saved. One evening, as the stars filled the sky, Daniel sat with Nayeli near the canyon. The memory of arrows still echoed in his mind, but now the silence was peaceful. He looked at her and said softly, "I once thought scars only meant pain, but now I see they mean something more. They mean life. They mean love. They mean we are still here." Nayeli touched the scar on his shoulder and nodded. "Yes, they are not marks of weakness. They are marks of strength." The journey was not over. Prejudice still lingered. Whispers still carried doubts. But Daniel no longer felt alone. He had walked through fire, faced arrows, endured mistrust, and yet, standing beside Nayeli, he felt stronger than ever. Their bond had survived the doubts of others, and it had grown into something unbreakable. From that moment, Daniel understood something deeper. Love was not only about moments of sacrifice in the heat of danger. Love was also about the quiet endurance that followed, the steady patience to stand firm when the world questioned every step. His scars were no longer just his. They belonged to both of them, to the life they were building together. The desert wind blew softly that night, carrying away the last echoes of anger and doubt. In its place came a new sound, the quiet promise of two hearts standing side by side, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Years passed, and the desert that once felt harsh and lonely became home to Daniel in ways he never imagined. The scars on his body had long healed, but they remained clear, etched into his skin like a permanent map of his choices. He never tried to hide them. When others asked, he would trace a finger over them and say simply, "These saved her life." To Daniel, the scars were no longer marks of suffering. They were reminders of the moment that had bound him and Nayeli together. Life between two worlds was not simple. Some settlers still looked at him with suspicion, whispering that he had abandoned his kind. Some Apache elders held back their full trust, cautious of what an outsider might mean for their future. But Daniel and Nayeli lived with quiet determination, choosing not to fight every word spoken against them. Instead, They let their lives speak louder. They worked together, they helped others, and they built a home where kindness was the foundation. Slowly, the doubts faded, replaced by respect. Daniel took pride in learning the rhythms of Apache life. He joined in planting corn, weaving shelters, and hunting when needed. His ranch skills also proved useful. He showed Nayeli's people how to mend saddles with strong stitches and how to care for horses in new ways. In return, he learned their traditions, songs sung at sunrise, dances performed at harvest, and the deep respect they carried for the land. Each exchange tied him more firmly to both families, the one he had been born to and the one he had chosen. Nayeli was the center of his world. Her calm spirit grounded him, and her quiet strength inspired him. Together they built a family. Their children grew up speaking both languages, carrying the stories of both her people and his. Around the fire at night, Daniel would tell them about the canyon, about the day arrows filled the sky. He would not describe it with fear, but with pride. "I stood," he told them, "because some things are worth every scar." The children would lean close, eyes wide, their fingers sometimes tracing the scars across his chest with awe. For them, their father was not just a man. He was a bridge between two worlds, but the story did not belong only to Daniel. Nayeli also carried it with her. She told the children how courage was not measured by words but by choices. She taught them to respect both the traditions of her people and the lessons from Daniel's past. Their family became a living example that love could overcome fear, and that scars, whether seen or unseen, could carry beauty. Time gave Daniel more than just family. The same people who once doubted him began to seek his help. Settlers who had mocked him now came to ask about trading fairly with the Apache. Warriors who had once questioned his presence now trusted him in matters of land and peace. Daniel did not seek leadership, but life placed it on his shoulders. His scars gave weight to his voice. When he spoke, others listened because they knew he had already proven himself in the most painful of ways. He never forgot the canyon. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he and Nayeli would return to the place where everything had begun. They would sit on the rocks looking out over the land. The sound of the wind moving through the stones carried memories of arrows and shouts, but also of survival and new beginnings. One night, as the stars stretched across the dark sky, Daniel placed his arm around Nayeli and whispered, "If I had to choose again, I would not change a thing." Nayeli leaned against him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I know," she said softly, "and that is why we are here." The years etched lines into Daniel's face and silver into his hair, but his spirit remained strong. He worked until his body grew slower, then passed his knowledge to the next generation. His children carried his lessons forward, and his grandchildren listened with wide eyes just as their parents once had. The story of the man who stood in front of arrows was told again and again, not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson in love, courage, and sacrifice. Daniel often thought about the meaning of scars. At first, he had believed they were only signs of pain. Later, he understood they were signs of survival. But as he grew older, he discovered something even deeper. Scars were signs of love. Each one was proof that he had chosen to protect someone more precious than himself. And in that choice, he had gained more than he had lost. On his final visit to the canyon, his steps slower now, Daniel stood with Nayeli at his side. The air was cool, and the sky glowed with colors of another setting sun. He looked down at the rocks where he had once fallen, where his blood had stained the earth. For a long moment he was silent. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Every scar I carry is worth it. They gave me you. They gave me us." Nayeli took his hand, her fingers gentle but strong. "And because of your scars," she said, "our children and their children will remember. They will know that courage is not only in battle but in love." The desert wind swept around them, carrying away the years of struggle and leaving only peace. Daniel closed his eyes and let the warmth of the moment sink deep into his heart. He had once been just a simple ranch hand, unnoticed by most, with nothing but calloused hands and a quiet spirit. Yet one choice, one act of courage had changed everything. It had given him a family, a place of belonging, and a love that had lasted a lifetime. When people spoke of him in later years, they did not call him by the work he once did, or the land he once lived on. They remembered him as the man who stood for the Apache woman, the man whose scars told a story of sacrifice and unity, and that was how Daniel wished to be remembered. Not for wealth, not for strength, but for the choice that had made every scar worth bearing.